She had folded the day into the small rituals that kept the village from feeling like a place at the edge of the world. A kettle on the stove, a patch of mending by the window, a lamp turned low so the shadows smoothed into shapes she recognized. Snow lay thin and dirty along the lane. The roofs were sharp against a cold sky. The war existed in the ways adults spoke more quietly, in packages of rationed sugar tucked away in linen drawers, in the soldiers who sometimes passed through and left footprints in the yard. It was a vast thing, a headline that sat somewhere far away, until the night it walked down her street. Marie had not expected thunder. She had expected wind, perhaps, that awful dry wind that came off the hills and rattled the shutters. Instead, a far, persistent rumble rolled across the valley like the belly of a beast shifting in its sleep. It grew and traveled, a sound that did not belong to weather, a metallic, measured thunder that arrived in pulses, then in rhythm. At first she thought artillery, the dull boom that had been part of evenings for months. Then, nearer, the clank of metal on metal, hatches, tracks, the staccato cough of engines. She rose from the chair, hands wrapped in flour-dusted dishcloths, and opened the door. The cold hit her like a question. Down the lane, past the lamp that burned low outside the baker's, a column of shapes moved between the houses, tanks whose silhouettes were black against the dim, soldiers with helmets that flashed from a distance, trucks trailing a scent that reached her before she could see them, oil and something sweeter and thin, like sweet corn gone wrong. The soldiers moved with a purpose that made them look less like men than like parts of a machine. They were tired, but there was a sharpness to their movements, a kind of hunger. Some slammed canteens shut, others caught their breath and laughed without joy. One of them, young, his face still smooth, shouldered a crate and glanced up at Marie's door as if to measure whether to knock. He did not. They passed as though her house were a piece of scenery and not a place where people slept. By dawn, the sky carried the ache of a milky winter morning, and the lane smelled of metal and cold. Men moved between rows of metal cans standing like an orchard. They were stacked 5, 6 high, blackened and dented, lined up along barns and under tarps. Labels, where they could be read, offered a strange map, stamps that hinted at factories, at ports overseas, paper traces of supply chains. To Marie, who had measured fuel in the hush of the stove and the hiss of a kettle, the sight was almost holy and obscene at once, monuments of abundance in a world of ration coupons. December 17th, 1944. 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld. That sentence, which would later live in paperwork and reports, meant nothing at first when you stood in the middle of the valley and smelled gasoline like a second winter.
The men clustered and spoke quickly, sometimes in German, sometimes in snarled fragments of other languages. One pulled out a folded bit of paper and smoothed it on the hood of a truck. It was full of names of ports and numbers and routing instructions. The paper was a map of more than miles. It was proof of a system so large that it made the valley seem small. It traced a route that began in places Marie had never imagined: Texas, New York, Liverpool, Normandy, then here, Hansfeld. The paper did not care about lines on her map or the people behind them. It moved oil like money, like weather. Among the men, there was a flicker of something close to hope. They had been living on rationed fuel, on careful calculations that could not be stretched. Tanks had run dry within visible range of enemy lines. Ambulances had been stalled while men bled. Trucks had been abandoned along frozen roads. To find fuel in such quantities felt like stumbling into an improbable miracle. They began to pry caps and pour from one can to another, and the sound of that pouring, metal against metal, the liquid whispering as it moved, was the sound of possibility. But the paper on the hood told another story. In the dim reading light, Mamsfests, those small bureaucratic prophecies of movement, showed origin and destination, a chain of industry and logistics that reached across oceans. For soldiers who had seen only scarcity, the Mansfests were a kind of cruelty, evidence that beyond the front, somewhere in clearer rooms and better-run factories, someone had produced abundance. The valley's odd treasure was not a sudden boon, but a very small portion of a vast industrial river. The soldiers read the papers like men trying to understand their own place in a machine they could not see. An officer frowned as he traced a line with his gloved finger. He had expected cachet labels and local consignments. What he found was freight that had crossed continents. A corporal muttered and handed the papers to another. The Mansfests were a mirror held up to the war's new face: supply lines, assembly lines, pipelines. This battleground was not only about who could hold the hill or who could take the road. It was about who could keep the engine running. From somewhere up the ridge, a voice rose, one of the more senior men, calling for order. "Keep them closed, mark them, nothing leaves without records." The order was practical, born of discipline and the need to account for every drop in a place where every gallon counted. Marie, standing at her threshold watching, understood only the edges of that command. She only knew that men with clipped voices now kept lists and guarded barrels with a kind of reverence reserved for sacred objects. In the months before, she had seen different kinds of soldiers. Some came with laughter and cigarettes, trading news and a bit of bread. Others came with a tired look that seemed to age them overnight. Now, the soldiers here moved with an intensity that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with supply. Theirs was a faith in something that looked like metal and paper. News moved through the valley like a fever. Neighbors gathered in doorways. A woman from 2 houses down who had been stitching a strapless dress for her boy's confirmation pressed a hand to her mouth when she heard the word depot. Children, roused from sleep by the drum of engines, were shepherded back to beds. Someone's radio crackled with fragmentary reports. The name Hansfeld was whispered as if it were the name of a saint or a wound. In the mouths of the men, it was both. Marie had no military training. She had never imagined that her fate might hinge on the contents of metal jerry cans. She had thought of war as noise far away, politicians' quarrels, a soldier's letter tucked into a drawer. She had scrubbed floorboards and mended socks and tended a small garden. Those were the measures by which she judged what mattered. Yet, as gasoline gleamed darkly in the hollows of overturned cans and the men argued about quantities and routes, something shifted in her. The war, until then an abstract specter, aligned itself with the tangible world, the fuel that would move tanks, the supply that would keep engines alive, the paper that proved a connection between Texas oil fields and the road to her house. For the soldiers, the discovery was a calculation: how to transfer, how to guard, how to use this sudden cash without overcommitting. For Marie, the discovery was an upheaval of her assumptions. She thought of how the village stove had gone out the previous winter when men had taken extra coal. She thought of the stretcher-bearer who had paused at her doorway the summer before, asking for water, breath hitching. She thought of the curfew that had been tightened just last week. What she had called survival in her house clustered now around barrels and manifests. The next morning, an officer's voice moved through a cracked loudspeaker on a truck and announced measures in clipped, authoritative tones. Men were told to form a chain. Jerry cans were to be catalogued. Certain shipments were to be requisitioned for operational needs. The tone was not celebratory. It was logistical. That tone carried the message clearly. Victory would not be decided by gallantry alone. It would be decided by the ability to catalog and move what a country could produce. If you tried to sum up what made these days different, you would come back to a handful of numbers that explained how the modern war had eclipsed the old. American forces, by then, consumed roughly 7.5 million gallons of fuel a day, an amount no single depot could satisfy. The Germans, even with their synthetic oil program producing an estimated 33 million barrels, faced a stark contrast against Allied production. The United States had produced about 1.8 billion barrels by that stage of the war.
Those numbers were not the kinds of figures Marie could hold in her hand, but she felt them in the urgency of the soldiers and the way headquarters radioed new priorities. There was a softness to reckoning with scale, an embarrassed whisper that told her these labels had meaning far beyond the valley. For the boys who had cheered at the sight of metal cans, realizing how small 50,000 gallons seemed against the teeth of the conflict, introduced a kind of shame. For men who had not slept properly in weeks, every labeled can represented planning, hope, a bureaucratic miracle. For Marie, the labels were a mirror of a world in which factories could make the difference between a convoy that moved and a column that stalled. The discovery at Hansfeld shifted the village's axis. Soldiers came and went. Some stayed, looting what they could carry in their hands. Others wrote down names. A few, eyes hollow with the weight of other reckonings, sat on doorsteps and smoked, their silence saying more than any order. Marie spent that day watching from the kitchen window, the folds of a tea towel in her hand, the smell of coffee, small, domestic, hot on the stove. 2 days later, news came of a larger panic elsewhere, Stavalo. Word moved that engineers had been ordered to deny supplies that might fall into enemy hands. The language was blunt in military reports, deny the resource. In civilian mouths, the phrase had a brutal force. Stavalo held more than 2 million gallons, 2,189,000 according to reports that later circulated in official dispatches. That many gallons meant an entire network of supply had been concentrated in one place, tanks and trucks and storage facilities that would become a conflagration if lit. People in nearby towns saw columns of smoke on the horizon the way others might watch a storm. The sky over the depot turned black, and the smell of burning fuel traveled like a new kind of thunder. You could understand, in a strict sense, why command had made the decision. Deny the enemy the resource, and you degrade their mobility and ability to fight. For a front that depended on engines, roads, and refueling points, a loss of fuel was the equivalent of a fortification collapsed. But to civilians, people whose lives were measured in loaves and a chicken's cluck, the sight of millions of gallons turned to flame had a different logic. It was violence against a thing that was already a product of violence. Oil pulled from ground, refined in distant plants, bound to tanks and trucks, and then burned because leaving it intact might mean those same engines would run in the hands of the other side. It was strategic arithmetic that knew how to be ruthless. Neighbors crowded at thresholds further and further back. They watched fields glittering with black rain. They tasted soot on their tongues. Children were wrapped in quilts and moved away from windows.
The village priest prepared himself, not for sermonizing, but for practical work, finding places for those who might lose roofs when flames spread, listening for the dead in the nights when shelling came. An ambulance that had been stationary for days revved to life and drove toward Stavalo, its driver white-knuckled and hollow-eyed. Every mile it covered ate fuel that could have been used elsewhere. The moral complexity sat in the mouths of ordinary people like an ache. A woman whose husband had been stopped by lack of fuel last month muttered that burning 2 million gallons felt like wasting the work of men who had pulled oil from the ground in distant countries. A soldier at the depot argued that leaving the petrol would be to hand the enemy the means of movement. Both statements were true, and neither solved the problem of what a burned earth left in its wake. Back in the valley, Marie felt the smoke long before the news reached her in full. The scent of burning oil is particular, thick, sharp, the bite at the back of the nose that makes one choke. It arrived on a wind that brought with it a dark smear on the horizon. For an afternoon, the whole countryside seemed to be breathing in blackness. From her kitchen, she watched men gather what they could. Some filled buckets with drinking water and handed them to townsfolk. Others carried out sheets and blankets. People who had been neighbors for decades learned their names anew in the act of helping or in the act of leaving. When the news of Stavalo's destruction rippled through command, it was not alone. Reports accumulated, depots burned, supplies denied, routes disrupted. In the scramble, a larger number formed like an ugly total. More than 8 million gallons of fuel destroyed in that period by deliberate action, scorched to prevent its use by advancing forces. The figure was shocking in scale and calculated in purpose. It reshaped the face of operations. It was also a moral footprint left on the land, an imprint of strategy made visible in blackened fields and in the hollowed-out faces of refugees. In the confusion of those first days, soldiers and engineers were not the only ones who had to make decisions. Civilians found themselves in the strange position of being observers and sometimes actors in choices they did not command. Some tried to steal fuel, a desperate gesture that freighted them with criminality in the eyes of military law, but with the raw justice of a mother trying to heat her home. Others sheltered young soldiers whose units had dissolved for lack of fuel. The law of survival sometimes collided with the law of war, and each choice wound its way into the fabric of the community. Marie saw a truck pulled up near the old chapel. Men in dust-streaked uniforms argued with engineers over access. A young private, cheeks red from cold and exhaustion, begged for one more can so he might bring his unit a little farther down the road. Someone with a clipboard said no.
The young man lowered his eyes and walked away. Later, Marie would realize that the soldier had been carrying a letter in his breast pocket, worn thin at the edges, a map to a family that had nothing to do with the movement of oil, but everything to do with human needs. When the orders came to set fire to certain depots, someone had to perform the act. It was not heroic theater. It was work with an awful competence. Fuse placement, ignition, ensuring that the flames consumed what they were told to consume and did not jump beyond the intended perimeter. American engineers, trained to do the hard administrative work of war, moved with that grimness. There was no cheering when they lit the matches. There was the dry business of accomplishing a mission. Marie did not watch the first burn as a spectacle. She watched it like one watches an illness take hold. The sky turned a different color. The flames climbed high enough to cast a falsified daylight across the valley. The sound of the blaze was both constant and alien, no longer the polite flicker of a hearth, but a deep, crackling engine of destruction. Heat pushed forward like a living thing. Her hands pressed against the window frame until her knuckles whitened. In that glow, she thought of the boy down the lane who could not get medicine because the ambulance had run out of gas. She thought of the family who had stored seed oil for winter and watched it vanish into a column of smoke meant to break the ability of armies to move. She felt a grief that was not about a single life, but about the architecture of resources that sustained life being turned, for strategic reasons, into a wall of flame. The engineers did not celebrate the inferno. They noted it on forms.
They radioed back confirmations. Such documentation would become a part of the historical record, a string of checked boxes and signatures that made moral ambiguity an administrative fact. The men who set the fires sometimes looked away, as if the spectacle of flame hid something between their fingers, the scent of victory or the smell of loss. At dusk on the day the depot burn began, a battered soldier came into the village and sat in the square as if he had nowhere left to go. He held a piece of paper, a manifest, and ran the edge of it through his fingers. The ink there spelled movement and also the limits of choice. "We are all at the mercy of supply," he said to the first person who asked, and his voice carried the sense of someone who had learned a lesson on the road the hard way. But to Marie, the sentence seemed both true and cruel. The war had arrived in the quantities and qualities of what people could take for granted. As night fell, the valley glowed with a distant, terrible light. Windows were shuttered, fires were built at hearths for warmth, not spectacle. No one laughed. The boy down the lane lay awake as the glow painted his ceiling, thinking about the tanks he had seen and the way fuel tasted like salvation.
An old man walked to the edge of the lane and spat into the snow, his expression blank. People sat with lists of names, trying to account for missing relatives and friends, trying to reconcile the arithmetic of production with the arithmetic of loss. Marie thought of the bag of ration coupons hidden beneath her bed, the way she had counted them like small, secret treasures. She thought of the garden, the planters by the window where she had grown cabbages and parsley. The war had been an abstract force until it touched those everyday things. Now, with the glow of burning fuel on the horizon and the smell of it in the air, abstraction had been made meat and bone. In the middle of that night, she stepped outside because sleep had fled her. The air bit at her face and cut like a blade, but when she lifted her chin, she could see men moving again, figures silhouetted against the distant inferno, working with machines, with clipboards, with torches. There was a weary precision to their movements that spoke of practice hardened into survival. One of them, a tall engineer with a face like worn leather, paused and looked toward the village. For a moment, his eyes rested on Marie's street, on the small lights that still burned behind curtained windows. He seemed to understand that the work he did had consequences that reached into those rooms. "Sometimes," he said to the soldier beside him, without emphasis, "you do the thing that will save others by ruining something." The words were quiet. They were not a justification. They were a statement of fact. To Marie, the sentence was harsh in its clarity. Ruination, in that moment, was what it took to stop a greater ruin, or so the logic ran. But logic did not warm bedrooms or feed children. Logic could not fix the layers of ash that would settle on fields and in lungs. She returned to her bed and lay awake, thinking of how the world now measured itself in barrels and manifests, in the flow of material and the choke of supply lines. Her life, until that night, had been measured by smaller things: the time seeds spent in the ground, the sound of a neighbor's cough. Now the intangible grammar of industrial war, through its tanks, pipes, and paper, rearranged the vocabulary of survival. What had always seemed eternal, the routine of her household, the constancy of the seasons, felt fragile under the weight of what men with clipboards could authorize. The next morning, a rumor passed through the streets like a cold that would not break. Piper had retreated. An armored unit had pulled back under orders that were as much about fuel as about the map. Tanks were abandoned on roadsides. Sometimes they were left with hatches open, as if the crews had intended to return and simply could not. One such tank, later a museum relic, would be shown with an empty gauge as a symbol of a new kind of impotence, machines rendered useless not by enemy fire, but by the absence of fuel.
Marie saw one of those tanks for a few seconds from the bend of the road as a convoy passed. It sat at the edge of a field, its tracks sunk into the mud, a rusting dinosaur that had stopped mid-roar. A soldier hunched beside it and spat, his breath ghosting in the air. There was no myth in that moment, only the plain fact that a machine designed to conquer was now as helpless as any tool left without the hands to use it. The village changed its habits. People who had been out until late now returned at dusk. Men who had lingered in cafes to trade stories found themselves talking about oil and pipelines. Women who had once worried only about the next loaf of bread now spoke in low voices about manifests and depots. There was a new vocabulary that threaded through every conversation. Red Ball Express, convoys, fuel dumps. It was a language of movement and logistics that would decide more than individual acts of bravery. In the kitchen, the kettle was an object of new reverence. Marie boiled water and watched the way the steam rose and bent toward the rafters. A neighbor's child came to the door and asked if she could warm his hands. She said yes and watched him press fingers to the enamel pot as though it were a talisman. The child's small anatomy of needs, warmth, food, the touch of an adult, remained the same. What had changed was everything that made it possible. Roads, fuel, a system of distribution that might choose to burn 2 million gallons in order to deny movement to an enemy. The child's fingers were cold because elsewhere decisions had been made to sacrifice the many to obstruct the few. That night, a courier arrived from the next town with a face pulled tight from exhaustion. He had seen convoys turned back, he said, because there was no fuel to bring to the front-line positions. Medical units had been delayed, food trucks had been rerouted. The courier's breath formed tiny clouds as he spoke. "It is not how many brave men we have," he said simply, "but how much fuel they have to move." The phrase landed like a physical thing in Marie's mind. It was as if an invisible hand had come and labeled the world with a metric she could not unsee. The capacity to move multiplied the capacity to act. She took to walking after midnight, moving through lanes lit by moon and by the glow of distant fires, thinking about the lives that were being reprogrammed by the necessities of supply. Houses that had once been full of sewing and gossip now kept lists of soldiers' names, of requested fuel amounts, of the names of those who had left and not returned. The village's center felt smaller and more fragile, a microcosm inside a larger war that had slid to the industrial heart of things. But if industrial capacity decided battles, it also revealed the human dimension that sat beneath the machinery. Decisions that asked someone to burn millions of gallons, engineers who placed incendiaries with clusters of hands, soldiers who emptied their tanks and left them idle because the road ahead was not possible. The moral weight of those choices did not dissolve into strategy. It lodged in the eyes of those who watched the flames, in the cough that came later from the smoke, in the emptier rooms of those who had lost what they depended on. Then came a day no one in the village would forget. A dispatch arrived by courier and was read aloud at the center of the square. It spoke of larger consequences, of convoys stopped, of columns immobilized, of the way a denied fuel source could reroute a campaign. The men who had once measured worth by courage now measured it by gallons. And yet, for civilians like Marie, the measurement felt abstract until its effects turned up on their doorsteps in the form of empty ambulances and the smell of burned oil. She had been just a civilian, and that distance had been an armor of sorts, thin but protective. When war came down her street that night, it penetrated not by bullets, but by the logic of supply. Barrels, manifests, pipelines, and the decisions surrounding them. The world she had taken for granted, her rituals, her lists, the small economy of a household, was exposed to the calculus of logistics. Her life now sat inside a column of supply that stretched across oceans and factories and railheads, and understanding that column was not comfort, it was a new kind of vulnerability. Toward the end of that week, an order came through the valley that soldiers were to begin cataloging every can left in the fields. Soldiers with pencil stubs in their hands walked from barn to barn, stamping numbers into ledgers and marking boxes. A particular ledger would later be preserved in a depot's archive, a cold list of metal bottles, dented and muddy, each one a trivial object and a measure of enormous consequence. For Marie, who watched a man in uniform mark a number on a page, the ledger was a kind of law. What could be recorded could be authorized. What could be authorized could be used. What could be used might determine whether a stretcher moved or lay still on a road. And then, one evening, as the sky went a hard indigo, soldiers came to Marie's door, not as invaders, but as messengers. They wanted to know who in the village could help ferry small items to the church that was being used as a temporary supply point. It was small work, envelopes and small boxes, a child's blanket, a tin of coffee. Marie went because there was nowhere else to be. She walked through streets that smelled of smoke and wet wood, passing fields that had once been green and were now spotted black from bursts of flame. At the church, men moved with the practiced choreography of supply, a crate here, a manifest signed there.
Someone handed Marie a list with a name and a number. Her fingers closed around it like the fingers of someone holding a kind of currency that had survived the storm. She realized with a peculiar clarity that the war had not simply come to the valley as a force of destruction. It had come as a complicated arrangement of needs and instruments, of calculations and small acts of assistance. As she walked back to her house that night, the chorus of engines began again in the distance. She stopped and listened. There were trucks on the road, and between them a rhythm of wheels that meant this column would not rest. The distant glow from Stavalo still painted the clouds. The men she had watched that day were tired in a way that went beyond fatigue. It was the exhaustion of people who perform grim tasks because there is no alternative that fits the moral imagination. On her doorstep, Marie paused and pressed her palm to the cold wood. She had been a civilian by circumstance. She was now a civilian lived into complexity, obliged to witness that scarcity and industry could be instruments of strategy and of survival. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a commander would later argue the clinching point plainly in dispatches. Deny the enemy the fuel, and you deny him movement. But in the village, denial looked like fields on fire and children shivering beneath quilts, like ambulances that could not go, and like the faces of men who had watched containers of oil burn because the calculus of war demanded it. The logic remained the same. The human bodies that bore the consequences varied. Marie lay awake that night, thinking of a future where tanks might stand mute beside roads, where a piece of paper could explain why a man bled in the street. She understood that the war had taught her a new grammar, the grammar of throughput and loss. When the column passed again, longer this time, a rumor that they were moving toward a ridge where the enemy was expected, Marie watched each vehicle as if measuring fate. Some were full of men, some were empty hulks towing tracks that would not hold. One of the vehicles bore the unmistakable silhouette of a heavy tank, its barrel long and alien against the pale sky. For a moment, Marie thought of how a machine like that had once conjured a simple idea of invincibility. Now she knew invincibility could be undone not only by shells, but by absence, the absence of what made the machine run. The soldier who had spoken of supply being the measure of action nodded to her when their eyes met. He had stopped for a moment and given her a cigarette, a small, awkward charity. "Fuel decides," he said, again as if rehearsing the lesson. "It decides where you can go and where you cannot." His mouth was crumpled in a tiredness that made speech unnecessary. Marie took the cigarette and did not light it. Instead, she slid it into her apron pocket like a small talisman of someone else's burden.
That night, the war had reached her home in a way she could no longer deny. It did not arrive with one dramatic assault, but as a series of small, precise intrusions, a rumble that became tanks, metal cans standing like obelisks, shipping manifests that traced continents, and fires lit to deny what might move. There was no solitary enemy to point at. Instead, there were systems, factories, pipelines, rail yards, whose logic was indifferent to the kinds of human stories stacked in barns and kitchens. She crawled into bed and tried to imagine a world where machines did not need such quantities of oil, where the movement of armies could be measured by human will alone. The thought dissolved quickly. The war had taught her that the world had been reconfigured, bravery no longer sufficient, production decisive. She slept fitfully, waking at intervals to the sound of engines and to the odd, almost sublime sight of a far-off horizon lit by man-made daylight. In the morning, a child on the street told her, wide-eyed, that an officer had read manifests aloud and traced the paper back to Texas. The child did not know what Texas meant beyond a place on a map, but the word carried a kind of mythic weight. Marie folded her hands and listened as the boy mimicked the rustle of paper and the whisper of logistics. The village, small and intimate, had been placed inside a stream of commerce whose headwaters were in places the villagers had never seen. The week continued to pull at ordinary lives. Men who had once joked at the tavern now measured their sentences. Women traded carefully censored news. Children learned the hush of curfew. For all the conversations about tactics and about convoys, a more enduring lesson settled into people's bones. In modern war, the factories between battlefields mattered as much as the bravery within them. This reality offered no consolation and no villain to blame exclusively. It offered only a change of categories. Marie remained, for now, an ordinary woman in a village that had been nudged into the epicenter of a logistical story. The events that had unfurled Hansfeld's small miracle and Stavelow's terrible pyre were anchors in a larger tide. They told of decisions that would ripple outward, affecting men on roads and families in houses and leaders at distant maps. For Marie, the immediate task was of shelter and the tending of neighbors and the small acts that kept life from dissolving entirely. But as the week moved forward, a new movement began to take shape across the valley. Not only men collecting barrels and engines moving, but also a gathering sense that the war had more instruments than bullets. People began to look at tanks differently. They noticed whether a gauge had fuel. They looked at manifests not simply as paper, but as commands that reshaped futures. In quiet hours, when the stove hissed and the night held its breath, Marie would find herself measuring the world in barrels and in what those barrels could move.
And somewhere beyond the ridge, commanders were still counting and planning. Decisions, not always visible in the village, were being made about where to send fuel, when to burn depots, and when to accept the terrible arithmetic of denying resources. Those decisions would, in time, be recorded in ledgers and dispatches and museum exhibits. But for now, in the snow and near the glow of distant flames, they existed as consequences felt in the stomach and in the ache of a child's fingertips. A week after the first rumble had woken her, Marie walked to the edge of the field where a line of tanks had been abandoned the night before. The machines were silent as hulks of iron. One, its turret swung slightly from where it had come to rest, had a badge of mud on its side. At its base, a cluster of jerry cans lay in a careless heap. Some were empty, their caps off, as if the last custodians had hoped to salvage the final drops. Others still held a film of oil that shone faintly in the pale light. She picked up a can and felt the weight of it in her hands, the coolness of metal, the dent of a blow, the faint residual smell of fuel. In that instant, she knew how a war could become a ledger, an inventory of what was lost and what could no longer move. She set the can down gently and walked back toward the village, the image of blackened fields and the memory of a child's cold fingers staying with her. The week was not done. Orders would continue to be given, depositions read, and choices made. Decisions to ignite would not be tidy. The moral calculus that underlay those choices would keep whirring in the heads of men who had to choose between immediate suffering and longer-term strategy. For civilians like Marie, the implications would be long and intimate: empty cupboards, the rationing of heat, roads that could not carry the wounded. The war had reached her home that night in a way that altered the grammar of daily life. She had been just a civilian. The rest of the world's needs had walked in and rearranged her days. When the sun sank and the valley cooled, Marie stood in the doorway and watched the road stretch away into darkness. A lone truck passed, its outline indented by the night, and in its wake came a howl of wind. She thought of the shipments, how they began in distant fields and ended in her lane, and of how the men who read manifests held in their hands a kind of power she had never known existed. She thought of the child who had pressed his fingers to the kettle, and of the ambulance that could not move. The thought that lodged deepest was simple and terrible. The war had taught her that what won battles now was often not the soldier's courage, but the factory's output and the pipeline's capacity. There was no answer she could offer to the problem of supply. There was only the knowledge that the world had been redefined, and that she would have to live within this new definition.
She stepped back inside, closed the door against the cold, and listened to the muffled sound of the engines moving away, carrying with them paper, metal, and the fragile hope that the next bend in the road would not fold into ruin. Outside, the night air held a last distant glimmer from the fires at Stavelot, a thin promise that the valley would continue to carry the taste of ash. Inside, Marie placed the kettle on the stove, watched the water bloom toward boiling, and felt, for the first time, how closely her small rituals were tied to an industry of movement she had never chosen to understand. The war had come down her street, and with it a lesson she could not unlearn: that in modern combat, raw production and the means to move it were often the deciding factors, and that civilians, in the quietest way, were bound into those calculations. Soon, orders would come that forced tougher choices on the men who guarded the lines. Engineers would be called to set incendiaries in towns other than Stavelot. Convoys would be rerouted.
tanks would be abandoned in deeper fields, and in the village people would start to count not only the dead and the missing, but also the barrels and the manifests, those inked pages that turned industry into destiny. Marie tightened the shawl around her shoulders and rose to put another log on the small fire. Outside, in the dark, engines continued to move, and the valley waited for what the next morning would reveal. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, less the easy turning of seasons and more the arithmetic of survival. Marie found herself rising before dawn, drawn to the window not by curiosity, but by a sense it was required, to count the trucks that passed, to note whether a convoy stopped at the church, to see if the smoke on the horizon still hung like a bruise. People moved with purpose now that had nothing to do with ordinary errands. The village had become a waypoint inside a problem that began in oil fields and ended in kitchen stoves. If you want more civilian stories from World War II, subscribe. There are more voices like hers waiting to be heard. On a late morning, an engineer's truck rolled in and was met by a small knot of officers who were making decisions the way surgeons might decide where to cut. He was not theatrical. He wore the sober expression of someone accustomed to hard practicalities. Word in the square named him afterward, Captain John Brewster, an officer whose unit was charged with cataloging and, when necessary, denying supplies. He moved among the barrels with a pad and a pencil, checking seals, stamping manifests, and speaking in short commands that made sense to the men who had been trained to accept orders and to the civilians who had learned, painfully, how to obey them. A young sergeant, later recorded in reports as Wilhelm Hoffman, had paused earlier in the week with a manuscript of papers he had found tucked beneath an overturned crate.
The papers, finally tracked through an anxious chain of custody, proved what the men in the valley had only guessed. Fuel here did not begin here. It moved from a pipeline of industry and commerce, an invisible river that ran from Texas refineries to Atlantic ports, and through logistics and contracts to a valley in the Ardennes. For soldiers long used to the immediacy of shortages, the papers were a kind of indictment. They showed that production had continued elsewhere, that abundance existed at a scale that rendered each found can a small, accidental fragment. Brewster, practical and careful, asked to speak with Marie at her door. He did not lean towards sentiment. He patted the little packet of rationed sugar at the corner of her windowsill and asked whether she had seen men taking anything or if people needed help moving blankets to the church. There was no attempt to make her a symbol. He needed civil cooperation. She could give it. She offered what she could: 2 blankets, directions to an upstairs storeroom that might hold a small family, the name of a neighbor who had an extra loaf. The conversation left her shaken, not because of his rank, but because of how intimately management of supply had come to touch the smallest units of living. That afternoon, a boy from down the lane was caught attempting to pry a dented can open behind a barn. He had not stolen for sport. His mother's cough had become worse in the weeks since ambulances had begun to sit idle, and the little stove at home had been put off 3 nights running. The boy's hands shook as soldiers found him, and one of the engineers watched with a look that mixed sympathy and duty. The boy's crime, in the ledger of the war, could be marked as theft. In his mother's house, it was a desperate attempt to warm the household. Marie watched the scene from behind the church's supportive beam. She felt that moral weight as if it were a physical presence, the cold arithmetic of denying resources to an enemy, sitting beside the raw domestic need of a child's fingers around a metal handle. Neither side offered an easy thing to love. The engineers followed orders. The settlers tried to survive. The line between necessity and illegality blurred into human faces. Reports kept arriving in fragments. dispatches scrawled on thin paper, radio calls that hissed with static. One message noted that greater movements had begun, a pullback by elements of the opposing force, a repositioning that implied not only tactical rethinking but logistical strain. Piper's name came up as one who had ordered a retreat in the face of stretched fuel lines, the story of mechanized columns stalled by absence rather than annihilation. Men abandoned their tanks on routes where mud and frost offered no mercy. Occasionally, a vehicle would be left with an open hatch and a coat still draped over a seat. These were not trophies of victory, they were evidence of failure in the supply chain.
In the village, some people cataloged their losses less formally than any ledger. Lost milk, an empty jar of jam, a candle burned down to stubs. Others cataloged differently. A woman who had been a midwife kept a list of families she had delivered in better years and mentally checked off who now had fuel and who did not. The war's demand for oil reached into every list. Marie learned quickly to count not only bread, but the possibility of making it warm. She began keeping a small stove warmer in a shed for neighbors, lending it out like a secret favor. Once, as she walked past a barn where men huddled over a map, a name drifted up in their conversation: Colonel James Snyder, spoken as the man at higher headquarters who would decide whether to authorize the burning of certain depots. His decisions would be made in offices removed from the soot and the cough, yet those choices landed in the village as smoke and as cold. Marie did not know his face, did not know his voice. She only knew the result. Then a notice came. More depots were to be denied to the enemy. The language of orders was clinical, the tone muted in the square as the messenger read aloud: deny, destroy, prevent. The list included storages beyond Stavalo, a directive meant to consolidate risk and deny mobility. The men who performed the tasks were often the same who later signed off on the paperwork, engineers who had learned to be precise with explosives and even more precise with forms. One night, a convoy loaded with pipes and incendiary charges moved out under a low sky. Marie watched from a distance, wrapped in a shawl, the hair on her arms prickling with more than cold. Though she would later see burned depots and a spate of blackened fields, this operation felt intimate and close. Men crossing hedgerows with torches, moving like a narrow, dark procession toward a point that would become a new reference for grief. The flames they cast were not dramatic theater. They were functional and terrible, a technical solution enacted by people who had to live afterward with the sight of what they had ignited. After the new burnings, the tally of lost fuel rose and rose until it became a number people could repeat with the same flatness they used to speak of curfews: more than 8 million gallons, dispatched in fits and indecisions across a narrow, cold front. The arithmetic did not make the losses less real. In the village, the numbers were embodied in an ambulance that would not leave the yard, or in the small boy who slipped petals of stale bread into his pocket and walked past the priest's doorway without looking up. With the passage of weeks, strangers began appearing among the villages, displaced people moving from burned fields, soldiers whose units had melted away, and a few who carried themselves as witnesses, journalists and archivists who made notes and took photographs for archives that would one day catalog what the valley had suffered.
A man with a camera took portraits of women with soot on their faces and printed them later in a paper whose headline narrowed the world into a few sentences. Marie's photograph, taken somewhat by accident as she helped carry blankets into the church's upper room, would survive into another era and be used as a small evidence of life amid scorched supply. Sometimes, when the road lay quiet, Marie would go to the site where a tank had been left days earlier. It had become a sort of mute memorial, a hulking emblem of how modern war could be stopped by absence rather than engagement. Children climbed its sides and pretended at being the drivers of an unstoppable future. Elders spat and muttered that a machine without fuel was as useful as a broken plow. A visiting soldier, older than most, saw her there once and trailed his hand along the tank's cold metal. "We depend on what we can move," he said without drama, "not only on who holds the flag." It was not a new insight, she had heard it before, but this time it rested on the tank's rusted contours like a settled truth. As winter eased toward an uncertain thaw, the immediate fires died down, but the patterns they had altered did not return to what they had been. Convoys rerouted on different lines, new depots were established further from the front, and the map of the military's movements shifted. In the evenings, people still gathered at the church steps to share bread and to talk about the smallest reprieves, whether windows could be mended, whether chickens could be coaxed back into laying. Conversation had been humbled into practicalities, but within those small exchanges a tenderness re-emerged, a woman sewing a child's coat, neighbors trading kettle stokes to warm one another. One afternoon, some months later and after the initial fury had settled, a former soldier came through the village carrying a small bundle of papers. He stopped at Marie's door and, without much preface, handed her a faded manifest. The paper had been on a truck when it stopped near a crossroads, he said, and the ink had held. It listed origins and destinations, hatch marks and tonnages. He did not know how it might matter to her, except that it had been found near where men had stood and where men had decided which barrels to keep and which to deny. For Marie, the piece of paper was another way that the war's logic had reached into private rooms, proof that trucks could be traced back to refineries, and that those refineries were part of a system indifferent to the small certainties of any one life. Time, the village learned, does not heal so much as it accumulates evidence. Years later, when peace had the awkward newness of a borrowed garment, Marie found herself traveling with a group of other women to a museum in a larger town. They walked among exhibits where tanks were arranged like bones in a catalogue, where hatches were propped open, and placards explained how logistics had decided more than single battles.
There was a heavy tank on a dais with its fuel gauge wired open in a display case. A small plaque stated that its gauge read empty when its crew had walked away. She stood before that metal and felt a familiar hollow, an echo of the helplessness she had watched one winter night when the engines came down her lane. She traced with her eyes the dented seams of the tank, imagining the man who had once driven it and the moment he decided he could go no further. Nearby was a photograph of Stavalo's black smoke, captioned with the figure 2,189,000 gallons, an official reality in numbers that lined up with memory. The plaque also listed other figures in quieter print: American consumption of roughly 7.5 million gallons a day, the contrast of German synthetic production said to be around 33 million barrels, and the United States' cumulative output approaching 1.8 billion barrels. The numbers were startling when you read them aloud. They were overwhelming when you felt them in the curve of a memory. Walking out of the museum into a clear afternoon, Marie understood that history would try to file these events into categories: strategic rationales, logistical failures, brilliant engineering, and that those categories might be useful for generals and students. But what stayed with those who had lived through it was a different sort of ledger, the small losses that did not make for dispatches. She remembered a child's cold hands, a stove warmed with a borrowed can, a ledger with stamped jerry cans. She remembered the engineer who had said, with an almost detached clarity, "You do the thing that will save others by ruining something." In the museum's quiet, surrounded by models and maps, that sentence returned not as rationalization, but as an incised moral choice. Marie had once thought of war as an event that happened to soldiers, After the night the engines came down her lane, she learned that war was a reordering of infrastructures, fuel lines, production quotas, shipments that could be burned to stop movement, and the brutal arithmetic that placed communal warmth against strategic advantage. She learned that decisions made in offices and forecourts could suddenly find their way into the corners of her house. She learned that survival could be a matter of being connected to a chain that ran from wells through refineries to rails and finally into a kerosene lamp in her kitchen. In the years that followed, the valley rebuilt its roofs and planted its gardens anew. New children learned the sound of engines without the same immediate fear. Marie, older and bent in the manner of someone who has carried a weight for long, found herself telling the story to those who asked, not as a plea for pity, but as an explanation of what modern war had become. She told of the smell of burning oil that had once painted the sky. She told of the terrified boy who went to steal warmth. She told of a tank abandoned in a field like a carcass.
People listened and then folded the memory into their lives, like a carefully pressed leaf. She had been a civilian by accident of birth and luck. That night when the rumble of engines first woke her and men moved like the parts of a larger machine down her street, that simple fact, her civilian status, ceased to be a full protection. The war reached her through things no one would previously have expected: paper, barrels, and the decisions to refuse supply in order to deny movement. Those instruments rearranged her days, rewrote her assumptions, and taught her a new grammar for understanding power. Standing in the doorway of her small house in the evening, watching a distant road where the last trucks of the day rolled by, Marie felt no triumph. There was only a tempered knowledge that the world had been altered, practically, morally, and forever. She had been just a civilian until the night the war reached her home. Afterward, she knew that what won battles had become as likely to be found in factories and pipelines as in courage alone. She had